Well, first of all, thank you to Shinge Roshi and indeed to the whole community for the honor of this invitation to speak on this very special day. And also, I want to express my gratitude for being able to attend the memorable memorial session here that concluded just yesterday. It was my first opportunity to attend a session in some time. My last was some years ago, and it was interesting, or maybe I should say amusing, to watch my mind cycle from on day one, why am I here? What am I doing? Until the very end on day 7, when, as I think many of us often experienced, all you feel is, thank you, thank you, thank you. So, thank you. One interesting thing that happened during the session for me is pretty early on I realized that the talk that I had written and brought for this event just wasn't going to do. Something else wanted to come out. Something else needed to be talked about. And so I basically had to kind of tear it up and put something else together, which means the edges may be a little bit ragged, but I hope that the main concerns will come through. Let me begin with one of my favorite koans, which goes something like this. A monk asks the master, "What's the constant activity of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas?" Presumably he's wondering, with these enlightened people, what's special about the way that they actually live in the world day to day? What mystic powers, whatever, do they have? And the answer, actually, Shinge Roshi just gave it a few minutes ago. Acting appropriately. That's all. That's the magic of Zen. Maybe not so special, and yet in another way it certainly is. So when the bell rings, we put on our robes and come to the sendo to sit. That's the appropriate response. Sometimes, of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Maybe friends come to visit from far away. "Welcome, so happy to see you. You must be tired. Would you like some tea, or what about something to eat?" And so forth. Now, for those of us here today, maybe I should say for all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas here today, it's pretty clear what appropriate action is, isn't it? I mean, we're here to celebrate the 40th anniversary of this Zendo and the 60th anniversary of the Zen Studies Society. And there's so much to celebrate. It's a wonderful opportunity to see old friends, hang out with them, have a good time together. But it's also an important opportunity to sort of take a step back and reflect just for what these two institutions, just how important they have been, both individually and collectively. Individually, how many people have benefited from the teachings and practice that they made available, people that otherwise may not have known about Zen, and how many people were able to avail themselves of that and really transform themselves. And institutionally too, I remember Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, is reputed to have predicted that when future historians look back in the 20th century, they will focus on Buddhism coming to the West, that'll be something that really stands out. I'm not sure he said it. I'm not sure it's true. I hope so. But if it is true, it's clear, isn't it, that the Zen Studies Society and Daibosatsu Zendo is going to play a significant role in that history. That's pretty much, though, all that I want to say about these centers, basically because many, probably most of you here, know so much more than I do about the history. Rather, what I would like to do is shift from the past to look to the future, to look, frankly, to some of the things that are coming down, some of the issues, some of the forces that are going to be, that are already impinging on our lives, how they might change or affect us, but also how we, with our practice and our understanding of Zen, how we might respond to some of these concerns. During our sesshin, one of our mealtime chants struck me. It's the 5 reflections. We would chant this before all of our meals, or breakfast and lunch. And it said, what is most essential is the practice of attention. And that seems exactly right, doesn't it? I mean, if our concern is appropriate response, how do we know what's appropriate? Well, what we're doing is we're training our attention so that we'll be able to tell what's appropriate. During sesshin, of course, it's very clear, the whole way that the sesshin is constructed and organized, it's to allow us not to be diverted, to actually focus on one thing. We go from one thing to another, from the chanting to the sitting to the kinhin walking and so forth. It's always very clear. We don't have to make decisions about what we're supposed to be doing. But when we look at the wider context of our lives, not just what we're doing here at Daibosatsu when we're training, but also what we're doing right now, it really raises this question of what do we need to pay attention to? Or what should we be paying attention to? Again, when we're here doing Zen practice, it seems very clear. But when we go back out into the world and we look at what's happening, how do we decide that? For example, when we're here, we're eating delicious food during sesshin, and we feel gratitude to Seppo, the Tenzo, and all of his assistants. But should we also be reflecting on the people who planted and grew and harvested the vegetables that we enjoy so much? What kind of lives do they have? Do they have the kinds of opportunities that we've had? Or what about clothes? I'm not sure about our Zen clothes, where they're made, but most of our clothes now, very few made in the USA, right? They come from China or Vietnam or Indonesia. What are the working conditions? What are the living conditions of the people? What does it mean when we emphasize in Zen, as Shinge Roshi just did, this relationship? We're related. We are interdependent with these people as well. What does it mean to be attentive, to become attentive to their situation? And what kind of appropriate response does that call forth from us? So what am I getting at here? Well, obviously, there's some hint here of what is sometimes called social justice concerns. And I think it's important for us to note that within traditional Asian Buddhist societies, this has not been a major concern. In fact, it couldn't be, really. The Asian Buddhist societies, as far as I know, none of them was democratic. They were all very hierarchical, very authoritarian. And if the rulers didn't like what you were getting up to, they could and sometimes would squash you. So you had to be very careful. The Sangha, especially in the early days, had to be very careful about its relationship with the authorities. And in a way, that's an important reason why Buddhism developed in the way that it did. The focus was very much on our own individual dukkha suffering, our own individual delusion and craving and karma, rather than being able to ask larger questions about what we might call today institutional karma or institutional dukkha. And to some degree, of course, to a large degree, we want to appreciate that. I mean, it's wonderful. I mean, Buddhism has by far created the largest collection of contemplative practices that can transform ourselves, transform our lives. But what I'm saying is there's been a price for that, right, to some degree. In fact, there's a sense in which, when you look at the history of Asian Buddhism, there's a kind of complicity that's been built in because the karma doctrine has been used to rationalize and justify the authority of rulers who obviously must have very good karma in their past lifetime to be born a prince, right? And also to rationalize the disempowerment of those born poor and maybe disabled, right? But now things have changed. Now Buddhism comes to the West and indeed to the modern globalizing world. It's a different situation. We're in societies, including many Asian Buddhist ones, are much more democratic, at least in principle. We have things like free speech, free religion, freedom of assembly, and so forth. And what this opens up is, of course, the possibility of new developments, new ways that Buddhist teachings can develop in order to help us understand and respond to the situation that we find ourselves in now. And this is where it gets really interesting, because on the one hand, for our generation, for the lifetime of, during the lifetime of most of us here, we now live in a truly one globalized civilization, one global human civilization, given the economics, given the communication and transportation. It's not East versus West or even East and West. It's really a sense of, a much stronger sense, a much greater sense of interdependence and aware of being each other. But here's the irony, the first of many, many ironies. At the same time as we have now a global civilization, we also can see that we seem to be doing a pretty good job of trying to destroy it. It's not just that we have this global civilization, it's a civilization in crisis. There's a lot of things one could say about that, but let me just shift to the broadest possible context. And again, this is all about attention and response. What should we be attentive to? So let's go to the largest context there. And again, as Shinge Roshi mentioned, what we can see is that it's ecological. Climate change, global warming, they're kind of euphemisms for what might better be called climate breakdown, something like that. I think it's pretty clear this is the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced. Another irony, we're doing it to ourselves. You know, it's not being imposed on us. There's no alien spaceships coming down and pumping methane into the atmosphere. Maybe that would be a good thing if it were, because then we'd sort of unite in a dime to fight them, right? But no, we're doing it to ourselves, and we don't seem to be able to know how to stop it. Another irony, although this is such a huge concern, climate change is just the tip of a much bigger iceberg, and it's possible that we might be able to solve the problem by shifting to sustainable sources of energy without addressing the deeper problems. For example, extinction event. The renowned Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson at one time predicted that by the end of this century, up to half of all plant and animal species on this planet might be extinct, or so weakened that they would become extinct soon thereafter. I think that's now believed to be a little bit of an overstatement, but nonetheless, I think biologists are agreeing that compared to the natural rate of extinction, species evolving, going extinct, compared to the natural rate, we're now species are being extinguished, largely because of human activity, at a rate between 100 and 1,000 times that natural rate. Question: what does that mean for a tradition like ours, where we take vows to save all sentient beings, when we're in the process of destroying so many of them? And it's not just, where to start? I mean, I think you're all so familiar with this. I don't want to overdevelop it. But just consider the oceans. Yes, carbonization, warming the oceans is affecting coral reefs and so forth. But there's a lot of other things going on. It's the overfishing. It's been predicted by 2047, the oceans will basically be commercially extinct. There won't be much in the way of ocean fish anymore. But at the same time, by the year 2050, I've read, there will be more plastic in the oceans than living species. You may have heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, this gyre swirling around the Pacific. Well, there's also one in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic. Scientists who've recently researched some very remote parts of the ocean floor, what have they discovered? In every square meter, they discovered plastic particles, many of which, of course, are ingested by sea beings there. What does that mean? What does it mean that honeybee colonies are endangered, or monarch butterflies? What does it mean that the aquifers that we depend upon are being rapidly depleted? What does it mean that topsoil is being exhausted in order to produce food very, very quickly for profit, but in a way that damages what's available for future generations? What does it mean for us as Zen practitioners to become aware of this? For our attention to turn to this? What is an appropriate response to this kind of situation? Well, as Buddhist practitioners, we might like to know whether there's something in the Buddhist teachings that can help us here. And I can save you some work. I've spent a lot of time paging through the Pali Canon and lots of other Mahayana sutras. And I haven't been able to find any reference to what we now know as climate change or increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. That's just not going to be there, is it? Nor can we expect it. The Buddha lived 2,400 years ago in a very different culture. That wasn't their problem. And the same thing for our Zen ancestors in China and more recently in Japan. We can't just, in a simple way, go to the texts, go to the teachings, and find either an analysis that can help us or answers that tell us how to respond to this new situation that we're in here. But, in fact, I think there is something that can be very, very helpful if we can adapt it to our new situation today. One of the Buddha's most important teachings, perhaps, is, I think, very relevant here if we understand it in the right way. A little earlier, I quoted from the mealtime chant, "What is most essential is the practice of attention." It continues, which helps us cut through greed, anger, and delusion. Greed, anger, actually I prefer ill will. Greed, ill will, and delusion, the famous three poisons, also known as the three fires in the Pali Canon, also sometimes three unwholesome motivations, or the three roots of evil. The Buddha didn't really talk much about evil. That's not a Buddhist concept. You know, the struggle between good and evil, that's more Judeo-Christian. For Buddhism, it's ignorance versus awakening. But when he did talk about what creates harm, this is what the Buddha often went back to. These three unwholesome motivations. The idea being that when what we do is motivated by them, problems arise, and how important it is to transform them. Instead of being motivated by greed, generosity. Instead of ill will, loving kindness. Instead of delusion, the wisdom that recognizes our interdependence with each other. But here's what I think is and needs to be adapted. What I mean is, today we not only have much more powerful technologies, which may or may not work as we hope they will, But we also have much more powerful institutions than in the time of the Buddha. And by institutions, I mean organizations that seem to take on a life of their own. That is to say, they have their own motivations built into them. They're not simply a sum of the motivations of the individuals, but they actually use individuals in order to further their own motivations. And the reason I go on and on about this is I think this offers us a Buddhist perspective, a Buddhist analysis, a Buddhist way of understanding what's gone wrong with our civilization. It helps us understand why it is that we are a civilization that seems to have lost its way, because too much of what's happening now is motivated by these three institutionalized poisons. What do I mean? I think our economic system is institutionalized greed. I think our militarism is institutionalized ill will. And I think our media institutionalized delusion. And I think we need to wake up to this fact. It's not just about working on our own individual greed, ill will, delusion. We need to wake up to this, and we need to find ways to address it. Let me just say a few words about each of them. Institutionalized greed. Well, if greed means you never have enough, isn't that a pretty good description of our economic system? Consumers never consume enough. Corporations are never profitable enough. Their market share is never big enough. Their share prices are never high enough. The GDP is never big enough, right? The solution is always more and more, more and more. But why is more and more always better if it can never be enough? Again, isn't that the definition of greed? I mean, the institutionalization part, think about it, how on the one side of the stock market you have all the investors, personal, institutional, pension funds and so forth, investing in the market because they expect a good return. That's why you do it, right? But on the other side of that anonymous expectation, that's experienced by every CEO as an unremitting pressure for returns, preferably in the short run. And here's the point. If the CEO can't do that, what's going to happen? Consider, let's take an extreme example, the CEO of ExxonMobil. Supposing he wakes up one morning, and it is a he, supposing he wakes up one morning and he's had some kind of awakening experience in the sense that he realizes, yes, we've got to change to renewable resources as soon as possible, that fossil fuels are destroying the atmosphere. Well, what's going to come of this? If the changes that he tries to make are going to damage the profitability of the corporation, what's going to happen to him? Well, I mean, he's going to be out pretty quickly. The board's going to get rid of him. So what that means is the issue there isn't just the individual motivations of all the people who form that corporation. If this is true for the CEO at the very top of the pyramid, how much more so it's true for everyone else down the line, right? Again, my point is institutionalization of greed means this need for growth has taken on a life of its own. And if we want to understand why we're having this extraordinary impact on the environment, this, I think, is one of the really important causes. And I think it's a Buddhist perspective. What about number 2, institutionalized ill will? I mentioned militarism, and we're here in the United States. I think we need to focus on the role of the U.S. in particular. In the last 15 years, Japanese Zen Buddhism has done a pretty good job of starting to apologize and atone for its cooperation, its support for militarism early in the 20th century. But what about us? What about our militarism? The United States, the amount of money that we spend in our military, it's like the equivalent of the next 9 or 10 countries put together. It's enormous, almost unbelievable. And of course, it's all to defend ourselves, but just so happens we have at last count, something like 727 overseas military installations, which doesn't include, of course, the secret ones where captives are rendered, or let's be honest, tortured. When the Cold War ended, there was this hope for what was described as the peace dividend, right? We didn't have to spend so much in the military. This was actually a huge problem for the Pentagon. What are we going to do now? But in fact, they found a new adversary, right? A new war. Here's the problem. If you're going to spend so much on the military, if you're going to have such a massive military, hey, you've got to find enemies. You've got to have wars once in a while, or you lose your justification. And in a way, the irony is that we found a pretty good justification, the war on terror, which it's already the longest war in our history, and as far as we know, it may never have an end. How would we know? But please remember, if war is the terrorism of the rich, terrorism is the war of the poor. And finally, institutionalized delusion. I mentioned the media because although we have an idea of the media as that which informs and educates us, that's not really what they're concerned about, right? Their concern as mega corporations is to find ways to grab our eyeballs and to sell them to the highest bidder. That is to say, advertising. And what's really important about that is not only that they encourage consumerism, but their fundamental message is never going to raise the important questions that we need to, that there might be something wrong with consumerism, that somehow consumerism has become our new religion in the sense that it teaches us what was really important about the world and how to live in the world. But a false religion, right? Because it's always the next thing that you buy, the next thing that you consume that's going to make you happy. I don't mean to be dogmatic about this, but I think this is the kind of thing that we all need to think about. We all need to put our attention to and to be asking, what's an appropriate response here for people who take the kind of vows that we have? Unfortunately, even if one accepts this analysis, I don't see that the Asian Buddhist tradition really tells us what to do. I mean, even if we sort of get inspired and motivated and we say, yes, we've got to do something about this, and we go back to the texts, again, they were written for a different time and place, and they don't seem to give us the answers. They don't tell us what to do. For example, my friend Grant in Boulder, as a former banker, he is working as a lobbyist. Sometimes he goes to Congress, works for a citizens' climate lobby. They are trying to push through a carbon tax. That's not really my style. I'm a member of 350.org, so I'm interested. I work to stop the tar sands pipeline, and now working to encourage churches and colleges to divest from fossil fuel stocks, things like that. Which of those is the best way to go? Buddhism doesn't help us, and the truth is probably that we need both of those and many, many more. But, and I think it's a big but, I think Buddhism has something huge. Our teachings have something wonderful to offer. Not so much telling us specifically what to do, but offering us a lot of insight into how to do it. You may already have a sense of what I'm talking about here. Where are we? Daibosatsu Zendo, great Bodhisattva training hall. The place where great bodhisattvas train. What I'm talking about is the Bodhisattva path. In fact, to be quite frank, I wonder sometimes if this is the most important thing that Buddhism has to offer the modern world at this particular point, given the kind of crises that we're now facing. What's really wonderful, I think, about the Bodhisattva path is the way that it combines, or that there's a dual or a two-sided practice. On the one hand, bodhisattvas continue their own work, their own personal transformation. Zazen, working on koans and so forth. That continues. And yet they're also aware that that's not enough, that they also use that transformation. They use the realization of emptiness, shunyata, or whatever that is creating within themselves. They use that to go out into the world and to address the problems of the world. Traditionally, of course, the focus has been much more on an individual level. And what I'm suggesting is, I think as part of the modernization that we need to look at, we need to realize that it's not sufficient just to talk about helping individuals. I think in the last generation in the United States, it's become quite accepted to become engaged in sort of service. That is to say, it's now accepted as a possibly important part of your path that you're helping people, like maybe homeless people or prison dharma, going into prisons, which is really important because the prisoners live in a kind of a hell, and they're also more hungry for the dharma than just about anybody. And also hospice work. I mean, it's accepted on this individual level. We can do a lot, and this is important to our own practice. You could say that we've become a lot better in the last generation, sort of fishing, helping drowning people, pulling them out of the river. But we're still not very good yet. We're still at the beginning stages of asking, well, why is it that there are so many more drowning people these days, right? Who or what is pushing them in the river around the bend? And how can we address that? You see, that's the institutional challenge. Nisargadatta Maharaj, a Vedanta teacher, said something that I think expresses the relationship between our practice and our bodhisattva activity as good as anything I've heard. He said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life turns." Huh? Beautiful. Wisdom and love, or wisdom and compassion, the two pillars of the Buddhist path, right? And one of the things I really love about it is the way that he shows the connection, right? So compassion isn't just something extraneous, that it's really essential to the realization. If the realization is the realization, letting go of the sense of separate self, realizing our interdependence, realizing that my well-being isn't separate from your well-being, well then how do we manifest, how do we express that realization in our daily lives? And that's finding ways to love people, finding ways to help them. And there's a really deeper insight here too, which I think is important for us to remember, because sometimes we think of the bodhisattva activity as a kind of distraction from our own personal transformation, which isn't exactly right. I mean, there's different ways to express it, but let me just say it this way. Suppose one of us has a Kensho experience, some awakening experience. Important as that is, that doesn't automatically mean all of your deep-rooted, habitual, self-centered activities suddenly disappear, does it? No, those are still operative. So future training includes the need to transform those habits, to transform the old way of thinking, what's in it for me, to this new way of thinking, what can I do to make this situation better for everybody? The point being, this is not only an important aspect of our practice, but this is actually how we transform ourselves. I don't know if I'm expressing this very clearly, you see? So being out in the world is transforming our habitual responses, our appropriate responses to the world. And so the irony is that in doing that, really the one that we're helping the most of all is ourselves. This becomes an essential part of our practice, not a distraction and not a diversion from it. let me move toward a conclusion by just saying a little bit more about the Bodhisattva path in order to give you some sense of why I think this can be so important, why this might even be the most important thing that Zen and the Buddhist tradition as a whole can offer the world at this point. What is distinctive about how a bodhisattva acts in the world? Can we say that the bodhisattva acts with non-attachment? Well, I've talked that way in the past, but I think it's a little more subtle. It's a little more tricky. You know, talking about non-attachment can give us the idea that, we go out and we try something, maybe try to stop fossil fuel emissions and convert to sustainable energy, right? So we go out there and we really try for a while, and, we're having a lot of frustration, so, well, we're not attached to results, so we sort of give it up, right? I mean, that's not the kind of non-attachments that's needed, right? I mean, clearly we're in a situation, this is not an option. We do need to convert as quickly as possible from fossil fuel generation of energy to sustainable sources like solar and wind, for example. But there are different ways to work toward that. And again, I think this is really, when a friend mentioned the distinction, this really was very helpful. The distinction between a sprint and a marathon. When you're running a sprint, maybe a 100-yard dash, right? The only point is to get to that end point as quickly as possible. That's all you're concerned about. You don't pay attention to anything else on the way. But that doesn't work if you're running a marathon, right? If you try to run a marathon that way, what's going to happen? You're going to burn out really, really quickly. So as my long-distance runner friends tell me, in order to run a marathon, you have to run in a special kind of way where, yes, you're headed toward a particular goal, but every step is whole and complete in itself. Every step is whole and complete. Does that remind you of anything? Does that remind you of anything in our Zen practice? Isn't that something that we're developing, the ability to do that? Still, the challenge that we face today is much greater than running a marathon, which, even if you're fairly slow, it's over after a few hours, some hours, right? In fact, it's so big, so challenging that it's sort of very difficult not to be discouraged. You wonder, well, what kind of effect? I mean, it's like this is just a massive, massive problem. What kind of orientation, can help us acquire the kind of motivation that's necessary here? Well, what about the Bodhisattva vows? Especially the first one, Shujo Muhen Seigando. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them all. Have you ever thought about what that really, really means? I mean, that's a big job, right? And it's like, it's framed in terms of a goal, but it's kind of really a goalless goal in the sense that, right, we're never going to get there. So what we're really talking about with that vow is a kind of fundamental reorientation of the meaning of our lives. Again, reorienting from, self-preoccupation, what's my own satisfaction and so forth, but this turning around and fundamental reorientation about the meaning of one's life. That's what those vows are about. And it seems to me that for those who have really taken those vows seriously, if we have, to then be confronted with the challenge of saving human civilization from itself, well, that's not easy, but that's something we can cope with. In other words, we've already taken this great vow, and I think we can see now that the larger issue of the particular historical situation we're in now, the need to transform so that we as a civilization, as a global civilization, are both more sustainable and more socially just. Within that larger framework, I don't see why Buddhists would need to be intimidated. Quite the opposite. I think that gives us the broader perspective that we need. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a famous motto. The really difficult we do right now, the impossible will take a little longer. Maybe quite a bit longer, but I think that's the point, that's the orientation, or maybe we should say, that's the spirit. But just one more point here. Anyone who reads extensively in the literature about ecological breakdown and so forth, anyone who does that, realizes we're in pretty tough shape. I mean, climate scientists don't always like to talk about it in public, but a number of them are quite pessimistic whether we're going to make it, whatever that means, right? I mean, we may well be close to or at tipping points in the sense that we end up with a kind of self-reinforcing warming going on, thanks to already now the melting of the Arctic and Antarctic seas, the disappearance of the Greenland ice shelf, and especially also methane gas, which as the tundra and the sea bottom is warming up, these huge amounts, billions of tons of methane gas, which are like 23 times as potent as carbon dioxide. Those are getting into the atmosphere. So there's reason to be concerned, not only concerned, there's reason to be discouraged. But what does that mean? I think what that really pushes us toward, or that's not the way to say it. What I think that reminds us, let me check my notes here so I say it right. The truth is, we don't know. We don't really know for sure what's coming down. We have such a variety of spectrums where we don't, we have these computer models of what's happening. We know from climate history that things can happen very, very quickly. Evidently, there was a period when Greenland warmed up within 10 degrees within 10 years, a decade. So it's not just, we tend to think of climate change as sort of slow, and no, it can be, we can hit these tipping points and it can happen very, very quickly. But we don't know. We don't know. And what does that mean? Again, does that sound a little bit familiar? Don't know mind? In a way, is that what we're cultivating in our practice? A mind that acts even though we don't know. In fact, not knowing is kind of a fundament of our practice. Right? One of my teachers, Robert Aiken, said, "Our path isn't about clearing up the mystery. It's about making the mystery clear." And we heard earlier the reference to the wondrous that D.T. Suzuki. To practice is to open up to the fundamental sacredness of this mysterious world where we don't really understand what's going on. We don't even understand what's possible until we try our best. The question is there a certain kind of don't know mind spirit that can sustain us in this kind of situation? When we return to the source, when we return to the groundless ground, it's not as though we suddenly sort of grasp and understand everything. It's the opposite. In a way, we open up to it claims us, and we find ourselves manifesting or expressing something greater than ourselves in a don't-know world that we never fully understand, but in a way that doesn't make any difference. Our job, and I think this is the really important point, And it's something that I think our Zen practice can really sustain us at this difficult, sometimes discouraging situation. Our job is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. Let me say that again. Our job, our task as practitioners, as bodhisattvas, is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. Obviously difficult for anybody, but I think our practice is something that enables and sustains us in doing it. Maybe this is what non-attachment to the fruits of action really means. We don't know what the fruits will be. We can't know. Many of us here are from the generation that grew up in the Cold War, right? That great struggle between America and the Soviet bloc, and with imminent danger of nuclear war at any moment. And we just kind of took it for granted. Until suddenly one day, the whole communist bloc disintegrated, kind of overnight. I don't even think the CIA saw it coming. Again, we don't know. Or South Africa. One day Nelson Mandela's in Rikers prison. The next day, almost, he's president of South Africa. What? Again, this is a strange world. We don't understand it. We can't fully understand it. But our job is to do the best we can despite that. True non-attachment to the fruits of action, which is, I think, only really deeply possible for someone who has a kind of spiritual practice such as them. Anyway, I've talked too long, for which I apologize, and I also regret if I've sounded preachy. I don't mean to sound dogmatic about any of this. It's simply that these are the issues, I think, that we really do need to be thinking about in relation to what's beginning to happen, and also in relation to what our practice, what our Zen lives can do in response, what we can contribute to responding, right? Again, the need to be attentive to what's really happening on these broad scales, and therefore the need to find ways to respond appropriately to institutional situations that we don't really, they're not very easy to grasp. We don't really know what to do. Yeah. It seems to me, my last words here, that if we Zen students don't want to do this, or maybe if we can't do this, if we can't become attentive and engage in the way that I'm talking about, then perhaps Zen isn't what the world needs right now. But of course I don't really believe that, because I've suggested to you that there's something so essentially important to the Bodhisattva path that it seems to me is precisely that attitude, that spirit, that's exactly what is most needed. Whether that's true or not, well, that's going to depend on you and me, how we practice and how we embody our practice in responding to the world. Thank you very much.